For those who are new to the group, welcome. We are part of the .NET Foundation. We are developers for developers, and we like to have presenters with practical experience. You can meet us and contact us on Twitter, YouTube, send us emails, and just take one of these links. And we also have this YouTube channel and a Twitch channel. And I would like to thank our sponsors. Without these, we could not make this happen. This is the board members, and we worked for getting speakers and scheduling these kind of meetups and all of that. And soon it's going to be for papers right now. So please follow the links, and the link will also be posted in the chat. And NDC also partners with Microsoft Norway, and we have a cool branded backpack to share with the winner of the best tech question. Also, there's going to be a cloud skill challenge that you can join about serverless, and the people who go in there can also win a Microsoft backpack. And there's also the Microsoft badge you can join. And recently there was giving out some gift boxes. It was really cool. And all of these links you can have on this slide, or it will be posted in the chat. They also have a Twitter account, so please follow MSDevNO. Today we are so happy to have Alexander Slotte, and this is going to be a really interesting talk, and I'm looking forward to it. And yeah, I can feel this one. And the agenda for the meetup is first this introduction, then about 50 minutes, the talk and Q&A afterwards, but we can also take questions during the talk. And with that, I would like to give the word over to Alexander.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to see you all and glad to be part of this. Thank you for inviting me. So today's talk is really about a case study, or kind of in my experience, migrating an older enterprise application to .NET Core for one of my clients that I did throughout a year's period of time. So I invite you to ask questions throughout the talk or save them to the end, whatever you prefer. Both works well for me. But before we start to talk, I just want to give you a kind of idea who I am personally. I am Swedish originally. I am from Uppsala, but I've been in the US for about 5 years or so. And I work for a company called Excella, but I'm also a Microsoft MVP, trying to support to the community as far as I can. I used to stream a lot on Twitch, focusing on machine learning in .NET. I haven't been as active as I wanted lately, but if you want to learn more about machine learning .NET, I organized a conference together with Microsoft and some other community peers, and we actually have this year's conference in May, and we have a call for speakers out right now. So either join it as an attendee, or you can also go ahead and sign up for giving a talk. If you kind of like what you see today, or if you have questions and want to reach out to me later, this is my contact information below here. My Twitter handle is Alex Slotte, and my email is my first or last name at excella.com. And I'll be happy to chat with you and give you some advice, and maybe even flesh out your plan to bring your applications up to the latest .NET 5 from whatever .NET Framework version you may be on at that present time. All right, so what are we going to talk about today? Well, as I mentioned, I'm going to go over a modernization effort that I've done for a client of mine this past year. And we actually just went live to production about a month ago with .NET 5. But we're going to start off by looking at the organization from a 30,000 feet view, or 10,000 meters if you're in Europe, and understand what application we're trying to migrate, what our constraints are in organization, and what our strategy would be to get there. And then we'll look at the real meaty stuff, which is the journey. So what do we actually do? How do we approach things, and what worked well for us? And then the end here, we'll sum it up with some thoughts about how what we learned from that and what we could have done differently if we knew what we have done for now. So to start off, let's look at the application that we're trying to migrate. So the app is very kind of standard enterprise old application. It's a .NET Framework 4.6.2 application with an API, just a web API, on top of SQL Server database, and they talk to each other through Entity Framework. It has a lot of old dependencies. It's a very large application, so like 20 plus projects in it, and it has a separate UI in Angular.js and Knockout.js, which is kind of helpful to know because we don't use Razor or anything like that. We use just JavaScript frontend separately. But the application is highly connected with other applications in the system of this organization. So we have interactions with BizTalk for uploading documents to SharePoint. We have tons of message queues like RabbitMQ, where we both publish messages to, but also consume from. And we also have multiple glue applications that call this application by itself. So this app is kind of the source of truth, as well as having its own UI. So we're getting calls both on the API, both through other kind of Node.js applications, and we also call other applications to make it more complicated, right? So it's a standard application, but very complicated, part of a larger ecosystem of applications. If you look at the organization itself here, the organization is kind of what you expect nowadays to some extent. It's an organization that says they're agile, but they're really agile in a bubble, meaning that the team that I worked with has 2-week sprints, and we follow the kind of agile ceremonies to the T. But outside of our kind of bubble in our team, the rest of the organization is still very, very waterfally. So you will have like multi-year projects with long project plans that can't be changed no matter what. And they have a culture of not staying up with the latest, which means that both the UI portions and the backend dependencies are outdated. They haven't been updated in 5-6 years. We have a lot of things that are getting out of date real quick. Something that's very positive about this team, though, is that they have a very mature automated quality practice. So it's very collaborative concerning quality. They have a lot of automated testing, and they have awesome collaboration across the team. The team size is very big. It's about 15 to 20 people, and that's kind of what the client preferred. And it's not ideal by any means, but we have a lot of developers, and a lot of BAs, and a lot of quality engineers in the same team. But it works just fine. So the first thing we started looking at from a standpoint is how to get buy-in to do something like this. Because if you do something like this at your organization right now, and I'm sure you already tried, you may get pushback saying like, well, what's the value proposition that you're trying to do here? Why do you want us to do this? And why should we care? And in fact, we had tried multiple times getting this buy-in, and we failed multiple times. And it was not until .NET Core 3.1 that we got long-term support from that package that we actually got some traction with the organization. And in kind of conjunction with that .NET Core 3.1 LTS support, there was also a lot of discussions about cybersecurity and security overall. So talking it from a security standpoint of, hey, if we update to the latest .NET here, we also can update our dependencies and making sure we stay up to date on latest patches and updates for our open source libraries. So having that discussion from a security standpoint really helped. We also talked about things from a cloud readiness standpoint. So the organization really want to go to the cloud. They want to go to AWS. And moving an old .NET Framework app to the cloud without just going to, for example, without going to a VM when running an IS is very difficult. If you, for example, want to go to the cloud through Kubernetes, for example, and containers, it's not really feasible to containerize an old .NET Framework application because it needs to run on Windows images, and that gets very slow and large. So we talked about it from the perspective that if you do this, you're not only going to be able to go to the cloud much easier, but you'll also extend the lifetime of your application. And that's something that is super important. If you can say, we can add 3 to 5 years to life expectancy of this app, that will really get the ears of the business, because that is money directly coming in. So what strategy did we take when we wanted to get this done? We had a couple of foundational pillars that I want to touch on here that we set up from the start. So we sat down probably in February of 2020, just when this pandemic was getting started. And we were thinking about how can we do this in a most effective and collaborative way. And one thing we decided on is that we do not want to plan everything up front, because as at that time, we didn't have much experience with .NET Core, and we didn't really know what were the things that would break and not work. And as a large application like that, it's very difficult to get a good overview. So we said, hey, let's do this incrementally. Let's just kind of learn as we go and don't plan too much upfront. And a constraint we had was that we needed to continue delivering features to the business. So we knew we couldn't have a separate long-running branch doing this in. We needed to do this as the main trunk. We needed to make this upgrade in place. So basically, we needed to, we needed to convert a car to an airplane while still driving it, right? Without stopping anytime. And what we decided to do here was that we decided to dedicate about 15 to 20% of our sprint time and allocation to this migration throughout the year, and having 1 or 2 developers lead that effort to plan out what's next and experiment, and then having other developers to kind of roll in and out of that on a sprint by sprint basis. And that's been really helpful. So I can definitely recommend having that dedicated time, but making sure you bring in the whole team in this, because they have to own the solution at the end as well. For us, there was a couple of key success factors for making this happen. And I'm just mentioning this from my perspective, but if you don't have these success factors in your organization, that's okay. But you may want to look into getting to this position on this point before moving a large enterprise application over. The biggest help for us was our test suite. So we had a lot of unit tests, which are not so useful, to be honest, in this scenario. But we also had a lot of functional tests. So we use SpecFlow to write BDD tests, behavior-driven design tests, hitting the API for us. And those API tests were crucial in discovering things that are broken, as well as a lot of UI tests in Selenium that ran on the UI level to kind of see what's breaking. And we'll dive into what those breaking changes are in just a little bit here. But I just want to reinforce it that as a mature test suite as possible as you can get it, it's going to be super important for you to get things done here. Another thing I want to say as well is that when you start doing this, it is super easy to get overwhelmed. If you look at old product files and old solution files on an old application, they are bloated with lots of stuff I promise you don't need. But it's very difficult to know what you don't need and need after a while. But the approach we took here was be fearless when cleaning up technical depth or cleaning up things that you don't think are important. Because it's more important to not port things that you don't need than trying to port things you don't need. And it may sound simple here and easy, but sometimes we go for the kind of cautious approach and we just try to migrate something even though we have no idea what it does. I just recommend you don't do that. Take a step back, be a bit bold, and try to remove things that have been there for tons of years and just clean up all technical depth as part of this journey. All right. So as mentioned in the beginning here, if you have any questions throughout this talk, feel free to post them in the chats. We can ask them during the talk as well, but we can also talk about them later at the end. So whatever it makes sense for you all. So let's talk about our journey. So we talked about the constraints now in the Prelude, about the app and organization. But how do we actually do this? So the first thing you do, of course, is you look at the documentation. And that's always a good starting point. And Microsoft offers 2 types of documentations for this migration. One is the kind of general .NET Core, .NET Framework, .NET Core migration journey. And the other one is the more specific for web apps. And they are good. They're not bad at all, but they do not tell you everything. And the reason for that is because they are very generic. Because every application out there are very unique to your own needs and what you have kind of made out of it. So my advice is start looking at it, but don't take that for the full picture, because it's not. It will also recommend that you use something called .NET Portability Analyzer, which basically is just a right-click in your solution, Visual Studio, and it will kind of look at the portability matrix, more or less, and it will generate an Excel list for you with thousands of rows saying, this is not compatible, this is not compatible. You can look at a list if you like, but I recommend you don't do that, because it's really simple to get, really easy to get overwhelmed there. There's just so much incompatibilities in a general application, and it's very difficult to tease out those common themes from that Excel list. It's really difficult to know what to change to make it go away. So look at it if you like, but then I think drop that instead and just kind of follow some steps here that hopefully will help you go down that journey. So this is the general flow of things we wanted to do when we went from A to B here. So I will go through each of them more in detail, but I wanted to show you the full picture and talk about what those steps are first. So first, of course, is to go to .NET 4.7.2, the migrate configuration schema, update your dependencies, port your web app, and update your CI/CD processes. We will talk about all these steps today, but we will not talk about WCF services or web forms, okay? And the reason for that is because we didn't have any services in WCF that we hosted, but we consumed them. So WCF is definitely another chapter by itself. If you host WCF services, you can no longer do that. There is actually a package that just came out 2 weeks ago. It's called WCF for .NET Core, I think, or WCF Core. And that should apparently allow you to do it. But I recommend, as far as possible, that you do not do that and then migrate over instead to something else. So that is, for example, gRPC, but could be something else as well. And Mark Oliver here is asking a question: did you try any other automated tools to convert or try convert or the AWS one? So it depends on which context here, Mark, but we looked at tooling to convert the app automatically, absolutely. But the ones we looked at were not conducive enough, and it created more confusion than they actually created value, I think, in my opinion. There is one out there right now that's just released 2 weeks ago. That's called .NET Update Assistant, I think, from Microsoft. And that one, I think, has promise. But the issue always with these tools is that they are very generic. And some of these things are very, very custom. And that makes this update process very difficult. But there are some general steps you can take, of course. A reason also why I don't like to use tools all the time is because they will not remove the technical depth that you have. Part of this journey is not only to convert your app, but also to clean it up at the same time. And like lose that kind of baggage as you had before and make it lighter. Because the lighter you can make it, the faster it will run, especially in containers. So that's super important. So Karim here asked, what are your thoughts on the trade-offs of doing this as an in-band versus an out-of-band change? What made you go for the first option? And I assume here that with your question about in-band versus out-of-band, because I haven't heard that before, to be honest, is about making as part of the sprint and as part of the same release. For us, we didn't have a change or opinion on that. We needed to make it as part of sprint work because our customer did not want to stop any feature development. So we definitely didn't want to do that. If the question is more about whether to kind of create a new application and then port everything over from the old one to the new one, that is a very good question. We decided not to do that because a lot of our lower level dependencies that are easier to migrate were just easier to convert to .NET Core at the same time, and then slowly kind of work your way out of it. But we'll kind of dive into different techniques, especially for the web app later. So I'll hold off on that question for now. The final piece I want to mention on this slide here is the web forms piece here. So if you work on a web forms app, go ahead and look at C# Frid's examples, because he has a lot of good content on migrating web forms to Blazor. And that could be super helpful for you if you're stuck in that situation. And for Stig's question here about benchmarking, we did some benchmarking, and we were about 30% faster after than we were before. All right, so let's dive into this. .NET 4.7.2. So the first thing you need to do here is update to .NET 4.7.2. And the reason why you want to do that is because .NET Core 3.1 and 4.7.2 both share kind of similar API with .NET Standard 2.0.
Alexander, there was one more question here.
Okay, sure, thanks. So Joan asked, what do you recommend as a replacement of WCF services instead? Oh, great question. So as far as possible, gRPC. gRPC is going to be your go-to here. But the trick with gRPC is that if you use gRPC as a server, then the client also needs to use gRPC to call it, right? So if you have control of both the caller and the server, so the client and the server, go with gRPC. If you don't have control of both the caller and service, you may need to kind of keep those WCF services separate for now until you've kind of have that control and can get that migration going. But in general, gRPC as far as possible. If you can change to regular REST APIs, also good. But I think the one-to-one match is more with gRPC. I hope that answers that question, Jonah. All right, so 4.7.2 here. So you want to go to 4.7.2, and we went from 4.6.2 to 4.7.2. And the reason why you want to do that is because you get a lot of shared functionality with .NET Core. Not everything, but a lot of shared stuff. And once you've done that, you then want to migrate your packages, so your package.config, to a package references in your CS project file. And this part here can be automated. You already have built-in tooling in Visual Studio to do that, and you can just right-click on the project and I think convert to package references, and you will get that done directly. So that's a simple step. The final piece here is to convert to SDK project styles. And basically what that is a new project style that is not linked to a core. It's actually linked to Visual Studio, I think 2008, 17 or 19. But what it does is it allows you to not list all the files that you need to include in your solution or in your product. And it will just assume that everything in your current directory of the project will be included as part of the build itself. And you can do this both manually or automated. So Andrew Locke has a lot of tooling around this to make it automatic. I recommend doing it manually, again, because your product files will have a lot of crap in them. And doing it manually will allow you to clean it up directly. So that's why I really recommend doing it manually. And you can also use a lot of wildcards here to make it a bit smoother and smaller of a project file. So for example, here, we want our package, the config. This is the old version, right? Where you see you have a package and which target framework it has. We want to move that to an SDK project style. And the SDK project style here is like this, where you see that you have an item group with package references, and they define which package references you have. And you have another one here with the product references as well. So it's much more concise, much smaller, and much easier to maintain. So Rune asked a question here about why target 4.7.2 and not 4.8. The reason for that is you can target 4.8 if you wanted to, but you don't have to. Going to 4.8 will not give you a higher advantage than going to 4.7.2, because 4.7.2 and .NET Core 3.1 share the same .NET Standard 2.0 API. And as part of this journey, as we'll see later, it's about getting all your package dependencies to target .NET Standard 2.0. So in short, it doesn't hurt going to 4.8. You can do it. It's just not going to give you any extra benefits. And it may give you more headache to do that. So that's my only thought about that. So once you're at .NET 4.7.2, and this may take a time for some people, because once you do that, you may get a lot of assembly redirect issues that you may have to face. So it may sound like a simple thing to do this, but it took us multiple months just to get to 4.7.2, and a lot of headache around assembly redirects. And all I say about assembly redirect is that try to wake up every morning smiling and saying, hey, this is going to be a great day, and just keep fighting that assembly redirect war, because that's something you will get custom with when you do this update. But you can get through it. So Morten asked a question as well about packages.config. It tended to list too much, meaning many implicit references. Did you clean this up to have only the top level packages? And yes, Morten, exactly. That is what you do. So basically, the new way of handling dependencies in .NET Core, you don't necessarily need all of that, the dependencies of the package itself being explicitly listed. You can just have the top level one, and then it will automatically pull in the rest. And that's also why I want to do it manually, that conversion, right? Because you have the chance then to really clean up your project files and make them much, much, much more concise to show just exactly what you're depending on and not everything else. So good point. All right, configuration schema. How do you migrate the configuration schema? So old web apps, they always have this XML web config, right? You're very used to this, nothing special, and you got transforms. Where we want to go is app settings.json. We want to go to more JSON formatted ones with sections and key values. So features is a section, and then we have the enable feature 1 and 2 as different key value pairs. And this may actually seem like a simple thing, but it's actually pretty complicated. And we took us about probably 2-3 months to do this as well. We had about 300 config values. Don't ask me why we had that, but we had about 300 config values in our configs. So moving this over was quite a feast. But I've written a blog post about this, about the steps you need to take. So if you want more details and explicit things here, you can visit my webpage and just find this blog and kind of look into it as well. But I'll walk over the general steps to do this here as well. So the first thing you want to do here is you want to create a custom provider. And what I say with custom provider is that you want something that reads both your old web config and your new app settings JSON file. Because for a certain time here, you'll have both in tandem. And this is seeing it from the lens of being able to deploy your app to production all the time, right? Because we don't want to have a long-running branch here. So basically, you create a custom provider, and we'll look at that in just a bit. And it will read both the old web config and the new app settings.json. The next thing you can do here is to rip out the system.configuration manager, because that's the old way of handling configurations. You instead want to install the Microsoft.extensions.configuration library, and you want to inject iConfiguration everywhere that's working. So the custom provider will build an iConfiguration for you, and you can then inject it everywhere. And it will obscure and abstract from where you're getting your config values, if it's from the app settings.json or from the old web config. And once you have that set up and all done, then you can start moving over key value pairs from XML to JSON bit by bit. And you can have them in tandem until everything is ported, and then you just drop the web config. Sounds simple, but it will take a while. So for example, a configuration provider that you may want to do here, a custom one, can look something like this. And again, my blog post has some ideas as well, but Ben Foster is the one that initially created this. But basically, you just kind of loop over everything in your web config, both connection strings and key value pairs, app keys. And then in the provider here, when you spin it up, you basically say, okay, give me an iConfiguration, use the legacy configuration provider that reads my web config, and add that to my iConfiguration. You can have a separate line here as well to add the app settings.json for you to make sure you read from both sources at the same time. So tricky, takes a little while, but it depends on how large your app is. If you don't have too many config values, this may just take a week. If you have more config values and you have to kind of coordinate that with your CI/CD pipelines, it may take longer. Because remember, when you change this, you will have sections. And sections need to be, section and a key needs to be separated with a colon. And that will be a different name of your keys than you have right now. So that's something to consider as well, that could be an extra added issue for you to do. All right, so we're good here. We are on 4.7.2. We have migrated our app configs or app keys to appconfig.json. We're good. So now comes the fun part here about dependency updates and porting the web app. So dependency update is a funny little thing here. And it may seem very simple here. But basically, what we're trying to do here is that we have a lot of old package, new packages, right? They all target 4.7.2. So they're compiled for the old framework. If they're compiled for old framework, you cannot use them in .NET Core. So what you need to do here is make sure that all your packages are targeting .NET Standard 2.0 or below. And if you look at something old, so this is a new picture, this is AutoMapper 10.0, but you see here that in dependencies, it is compiled against .NET Standard 2.0. So we can use that. That is a good one, good to go. But for our perspective, when we started doing this, we had we have AutoMapper 3.0, so 7 releases earlier. And this one only had like the old framework dependencies, and we had no way of doing this for .NET Core. So we had to go through all our packages and update each of them to a version that supported .NET Standard 2.0. And this is not as simple as it sounds, because as you do this, you will have breaking API changes that you have to refactor for. You will have changing in behavior because AutoMapper 3.0 is very different from 10.0, so the behavior has changed as well. So you may also get assembly redirect issues here because dependencies that AutoMapper depends on for 10.0 may be a different, newtons of JSON file, for example, than something else. So suddenly you have multiple versions of different dependencies in your app, which causes confusion. And that's where you need that assembly redirect to take place. So you will fight a lot of battles here, but it's fully doable. So once in tandem, as you're working on your updates of your package dependencies, one thing you need to do as well or consider here is enabling multi-framework targeting, or target.NET Standard 2.0. So right now, all of our old apps, all of our old projects, they are targeting .NET 4.7.2 because that was run on. But at some point, we want to get to .NET Core 3.1, or in current state, I think .NET 5. So there's two paths to go down here. One way is saying, I'm going to target .NET 4.7.2 and .NET Standard 2.0, or I'll target .NET Core and 4.7.2. Does anyone here on the call right now know why you would like to just target .NET Standard 2.0? Or sorry, why you would not want to target .NET Standard 2.0? And since we don't really have a good feedback mechanism here, I'll give you the answer. So if you have Entity Framework in your application today, you cannot target .NET Standard 2.0. And the reason for that is because Entity Framework, the 6.4 version, can actually be used in .NET Core. So if you do not want to update Entity Framework to EF5, for example, and you want to stay on the old EF 6.4 for a bit, which I recommend, you actually have to go to multi-targeting frameworking. And the reason for that is because EF 6.4 is compiled against .NET 4.7.2 and .NET Standard or 2.1. And those two do not share APIs. They do not. .NET Standard 2.1 is the same, more or less, as .NET Core 3.1. So in that case, you will need to make sure that you have multi-framework targeting enabled here, so you can have both at the same time. But we can talk more about the EF upgrade later, but I strongly recommend that you do not upgrade Entity Framework as part of this journey. Kind of stay on the old framework as long as you can, because that is a risk by itself, and it's a large endeavor to port an old EF 6.4 application to EF5. It is not worth the risk, I think, in the beginning for an enterprise application. And that's great input, Morten. Morten added some redirect information about creating automatic redirects. This did not work for us, actually. So we tried this, Morten, for application. Fun enough, it did not work. So I think you can have mixed results on this one. I encourage you all to try Morten's advice about auto-generating redirects. It's definitely worth trying. I'll just say that we tried it and it did not work for us as well as we hoped. So we were stuck with manually writing those instead. So if you go ahead and do multi-framework targeting, so you target both 4.7.2 and .NET Core 3.1, what you want to do, the reason why you do that is because you want to build your old framework application in your CI pipelines, and you want to deploy that to production, right? Incrementally. So you always continue to release features. But at the same time, in tandem, you want to start building your app in .NET Core 3.1 because you want to understand what is breaking. So what packages are not updated yet, what part of your code is not functional with .NET Core, and so forth. And that is really helpful. So you can have one thing that goes to production, and the second one that you continue to build to get feedback quickly and input on what's not working and working. And as you do that, a very handy thing is using conditional dependencies, which basically says that this dependency here, include that only if I'm running 4.7.2, otherwise do not do that. And one of those challenges for us was SignalR, because SignalR is a separate package in the back in the day, but it's currently part of the .NET Core MVC package right now instead. So we had to kind of feature toggle that off a little bit when we built in .NET Core 3.1 and build out a new structure for completely in the code just for that. And together with conditional dependencies, you can do that with pre-processor directives. It's basically those kind of flags in your code saying if we're running on .NET 4.7.2, do this code, otherwise do not do this code. I cannot stress enough how important these pre-processor directives were for us to succeed. Without them, I think it would be very, very difficult to massage ourselves out of the situation of running an old enterprise application with so many old dependencies bit by bit. So basically what we could do here is that we just said that we know that this dependency and this part of the code is not compatible with .NET Core. That's okay. We'll just flag it completely off and say only do this in .NET 4.7.2, which caused the application to build in .NET Core 3.1 anyway. And then we created tickets in Jira for each of these incompatibilities. So each package that was incompatible or something else, and we addressed them sprint by sprint. So slowly eating the elephant bit by bit instead of doing it all at the same time. But our application was still building and still working for the production-ready .NET 4.7.2 version instead. So a couple of got-yous when you're updating packages here. As you start going through your packages and trying to find the .NET Standard 2.0 version, you will see quickly that a lot of packages have reached end of life. They are not supported anymore because the open source contributor has just left them. And that's okay. We don't pay them, right? So we can't expect that to be the case. So for example, for us, we ran into issues with a couple of testing libraries we used that were no longer supported. We ran into issues with email template generation for like Razors, stuff like that. I think it was Razor Engine that we ended up choosing Razor Lite for. That's okay. But just be aware that you may also have some effort here of porting your code to a new dependency instead. The second thing I want to mention again is behavioral changes. You will absolutely have API changes, breaking API changes in your code, which is probably not too bad to resolve most of the time. But something that's much more difficult to find is behavioral changes. So to give an example, we had AutoMapper 3.0 to 10.0. That was a big jump, and it caused things to just work very differently. So suddenly our mappings were not working as expected, and we did not know why. We had no compile issues, but we had runtime issues. And we sometimes didn't have runtime issues. We just worked differently. We really relied on our functional tests to find these things. And I really recommend that you create a couple of yourselves as well to lean against when you do these changes, because that will really find things that you may miss or find things that you just want to make sure you know about before you release to production. Because remember, sometimes when you do this in band or in the application like this, you may inadvertently cause something to break in your production version in .NET 4.7.2 if you update a package. So for example, if you update AutoMapper to 10.0, you will update the package for both the new and the old version in tandem. You want to make sure they work for both versions at the same time. So Mark here is asking a great question. Do you have a separate pipeline for your 4.7.2 and .NET Core code to support testing? We did in the end. We did not in the beginning. In the beginning, when a lot of things were breaking and we had so much to do still, we did not have that. And we focused mostly on just iron those things out and testing it locally if we could. But as we kind of got to more mature application and to the web app, we started adding a different CI pipeline for building .NET Core 3.1 and deploying that to a server to test as well. And eventually at the end here, we actually just closed our old pipeline and just started using the other one to production instead. But it basically was just, what we did was just a copy of the old pipeline and then just modified it to work for .NET Core. But it's definitely a good idea, Mark, to do that when you can, as early as possible. It's very helpful. So the third part here is that I will reiterate it again and again. You will have to fight the redirect war. You may not, with Morten's comment, so hopefully not. But it's definitely something you kind of have to prepare yourself for, at least, nothing else, because they will definitely become an issue at some point. And Morten asked the question here as well, will the VS NuGet package manager handle conditional references well due to partial multi-targeting? Get suggestions for the file we can't yet use. Let me think here. I think when we used the NuGet package manager for that, it did pretty well. I will say they added packages directly to the .NET 4.7.2 version instead. We, to be honest, did not use the package manager too much for these things. When we knew that we had to update a package for both the old and a new version, we just went ahead and used the package manager for both, and it added like the common section. When we wanted to separate something out that was only working for one version, we did it manually in the project files. I will say though, Morten, we did this just before the release .NET 5.0. So we didn't have too many of those conflicts where you had to like force yourself up to 5.0. But when it comes to like the Microsoft dependencies, that is, it's not going to work to run both there, right? So you may want to start running the ones that go on standard 2.0 first, before you go on the packages that require the full 5.0 framework version itself. And moving from like .NET Core 3.1 to .NET 5 is a lot easier than moving from .NET Core, .NET Framework to .NET Core. Long answer. I hope that made some kind of sense, Morten. I'm sorry otherwise. Please send me a message on Twitter if you want to talk about that more. All right. So moving along here to one of the biggest pieces here. And this is where we're going to talk about strategies a bit more and techniques, because porting the web app is one of the biggest things you will do. And this is definitely complicated and something I want to spend some time on investigating. So we talked a lot about, our lower dependencies, like the common libraries, the domain libraries, the database layer, those kind of things. We can just change that in place. We updated our dependencies, we updated our versions, we updated package and project files. They was just fine. But when you go to the web app, you can't do the same thing. You will need to create a new project, and you will basically need to migrate the global ASAC file to a star.cs file in the new project. And you need to move over all the controllers and namespaces and clean up some things and make sure that things seems to work as expected. And this is a lot more complicated than changing in place, I would say. But one thing I really want to stress here again is that it can be very tempting once you get here to start having a long-running branch, to just do the web app separately. But I really encourage you not to, because it can take a lot longer to do this than you expect. And it's very difficult to keep track of changes to your controllers in one part as opposed to the other one. So try to keep one branch as far as possible and do this bit by bit. So there's a couple of ways you can do this, right? One way you can do this, and you should probably have thought about this earlier, is by not doing it at all. Some apps should not be migrated. I'll say it out loud. Some apps are so small and so complicated and so old that you don't want to migrate them. Just rewrite them from scratch in Blazor or something else. It's much, much easier to do that than taking the hard path of migrating them. But if you have something larger that's worth the migration effort, you can either choose to go one of three options, I would say. You can go a big bang with a web app. So basically having a long-running branch, right? And you decide to just deploy everything to production at the same time. Or you can have a side-by-side with redirects. So basically you can have the old app, and then you can have a new app running side-by-side, and you can redirect between different domains. So you can have a certain part of your application running in the new stuff and some in the old stuff. And that could work. It depends on your use case. And the final piece here, apologies, dry throat. The final piece here is incrementally without redirects with a small bang. And obviously this is a mouthful, and this is something we used, because otherwise I would not have come up with this strategy here. And I will talk about what I mean here, because it's a very stupid name. So please someone come up with an acronym for this, that would be helpful. But basically we did something called incrementally without redirects with a small bang. So what do I mean with that? Well, let's look at the code first here. So what does a web app consist of? Well, it basically consists of two things here. Slow changing code, like infrastructure and piping, and fast changing code, like controllers and view models and those kind of things that change by feature and feature. And they are something that we may want to focus on later. So the slow changing code are things like setting up autofac, setting up your automapper instances, setting up logging, exception handling, all those kind of piping stuff. And those never really change, very often at least. So what you can do here is actually create a new project and slowly move those things over to the new one. So you can have a project side by side with your old project, your web product, and you can create a ticket for each of these things. So you can say, hey, I want to set up autofac in my .NET Core web app. I want to set up automapper, filters, and logging, and so forth. And you do that incrementally, bit by bit, and you make sure that each thing works as expected by testing it locally, saying, hey, I want to make sure my logging works. Okay, it logs messages to my log message. Perfect, great. Authorization, for example, make sure that works also. And this is a very good approach to eating the elephants in bits instead of doing it all at once and still getting it part of your sprint, driving engagement from your developers in your team, because they can also be part of this. It's not very often your team members has a chance to set up Autofac or Automapper at all. So if you can actually bring them into this discussion, they will be much more engaged and feel ownership of the application itself. The second part here is kind of where we had a lot of discussions. It's a fast changing code. Things like controllers, view models, and all those things. And we actually use a custom tool to convert this. We built our own tool to make this change, because this is something that we could not do at one time. So when you start looking at controllers and view models, you can't really do it incrementally, because features may change those things, and you have to then keep track of the changes to controller in one product to another, and that's a nightmare. So you do not want to do that. And we did not want a long-running branch neither, because of the same reason. So we wanted something that could, at a whim, port everything over from one product to another and migrate the namespaces, migrate the usages, all those things in an automatic fashion. And currently, there's nothing on the market that does that, and it's also very custom depending on your use case. But basically what we did here is we iterated over this tool. We took the master branch here, and we piped the master branch into a console application that did things like global namespace adjustments, updating controllers, that making sure that I had the right dependencies. Things like that changed in the old to new are return messages, for example. Instead of using HTTP response message, we now use like I action result. And all those things are globally changeable. They can be done on like just regex and change them everywhere. So this tool, what it does is that it applies those changes to the master branch, the old framework, and it spits out a functional .NET Core web app that you can use. And then on that web app, you can then run your automated test and your manual test. And based on what works and doesn't work, you can either update the tool to tweak some things to make sure that globally we make this change, or if there are things that are more general changes that apply to both .NET Framework and .NET Core, you can then create a ticket and make that change directly in the master branch instead, which is the second path here. But the key here is that you discard a branch when you tested it, and instead you try to iterate over this process over and over again until your tool is in a state where it can always create a new functional .NET Core application for you that passes all your manual tests and exploratory tests. And once you have that, you can create a branch with that change and a PR to merge into master. And then that is when you're ready to actually deploy this production. Because when you commit to this change, it's very difficult to back out of it. So having that kind of safety net around it is super, super helpful, and something I highly encourage you to do in some way or another. And this app is not very large. I think we wrote about 200-300 lines of code, but it is very custom to your specific use case or what needs to change. And that's why it's not an open source tool yet. But I'm happy to chat more about this approach and what this app does anytime. So just kind of chat me up on Twitter or email or wherever, and I'm happy to discuss it more as well. Because I think this was a key thing. It really helped us iterate, be part of a sprint, and be very risk adverse. So before we commit to this, we actually knew exactly that things are working as expected. So one thing I was just going to call out though is that be very cautious about .NET Core. There's a couple of things that change from the old framework to the new one. For example, ambiguous endpoints, things with the same route. We had quite a few of them in the old framework, which are terrible, to be honest, to have, but they worked. .NET Core, in many ways, are much more strict, and it does not allow for this to happen. So we did not see it at all. Same thing with like default values for view models. So if your UI skips setting a default value for a view model, for example, setting a Boolean, just skips it, the old framework will actually set it for you. But the new one will not, and it will throw an exception instead. And I'll go through this slide real quick before I answer Stig's question here, just to summarize this. The other thing here as well is that the API controller attribute that you can set on your new controller, so API controller attribute, or the decoration there, is actually something that's new for .NET Core. You can set that on your controllers to give them some superpowers to bind, post calls and what have you. Just be very cautious with this, because if you set it and use it, it will also change the behavior of your controllers as opposed to the full framework. For example, it will cause your validation of required attributes in your view models to happen before it hits the API. That could be good. That could be bad. Depends on your application. For us, it was bad because we had custom validations on the back. So we wanted that call to come all the way through so we can make some custom messaging here as well. But it depends on use case. Just be aware that I will change things. Other things that we run into were like authentication issues with BizTalk. You can set impersonation to work there. So if you're using BizTalk with .NET Core, just be cautious here because you can have some issues that you did not expect. And also make sure you're very explicit in everything. Like .NET Core is just very explicit and very strict on certain standards, which I think is really, really good. I love it. It's just that you have to be careful here not to miss something. So I think Stig's question went out of picture here. Here it is. Perfect. Thank you. So did you move away from AutoFac in end using the built-in IOC container? That is a very good question. The answer is no, we did not. We thought about it for a long time, something we wanted to do. But when you're kind of in this transformation, something you realize very quickly is that it's very risky. There's a lot of change. And if there's any way you can minimize the change and the risk, you should take it. It doesn't mean you should stay on AutoFac if you can go to the old one, the new one, because I do think it's better to go to the built-in one. It's just if you decide to, hey, the change for AutoFac to get it to work is a day's work versus completely refactoring all your IOC container to the new one, which has a higher risk, that may be not worth the trade-off. For us, it was not worth the trade-off, so we skipped it. For others, it may well be worth the trade-off, so you should do it. But it really depends on your use case, I would say. But try to spin off as much risk as possible to separate initiatives without, avoiding to clean up technical debt if you can. So I'll skip the last part here because I want to go to lessons learned instead, and then I want to kind of leave for questions if you have any more here. But this year journey was really, really fantastic, and I really encourage you all to go down this path. And it may be much faster than a year's journey depending on your application, but it was super worth it. Our application is running much, much faster, like 35%. It's containerizable now. It is much easier to work with. It loads fast from the studio. Everything is just much more pleasant to work with. And I know all the developers are happy, as well as the business as well, being up on this framework. But a couple of things I would say that I will bring with me to the next change here is that unit tests are not very helpful for this transformation because they will not tell you higher level things that have broken, for example, the API or changing behavior on AutoMapper. But functional tests are super helpful. Run them and create them. They are going to save your day. I can't recount how many times it saved my day. So just please look at that if you can. They'll be something you will really benefit from. Again, if you want to change in place, like we did here, and slowly massage your way out of this application, use pre-processed directives as far as possible because they can really save your day and make it much easier to break down your work into smaller chunks. The fourth thing I want to say is do not go to EF Core or EF5 if you can. It is something that people just assume they have to do. You don't have to do it. And it's not that I don't like EF Core or EF5. I love it. I would love us to go there. But it is not a migration effort. It's a porting effort. EF64 is not the same as EF5 or EF Core. They have the completely different API and different behavior. So it's much more of an effort, and it's very risky. So I would just kind of avoid doing that at the same time and then schedule that as a separate initiative later on. Consider staying on IS. It can be very easy to think about going to Kestrel directly, and you should go to Kestrel. I'm not saying you shouldn't. But again, think about doing that separately. Say like, hey, I'll host this core application in IS for now, and then in the future, I will go to Kestrel once I feel like we're comfortable and complete there. It's up to you, but my recommendation is staying on IS for a little bit, so you're just landing, and then you're taking the next step after that. And again, the web app is going to be the hardest part. It's going to be where you have the most uncertainties. So depending on what your business is okay with, you can take different approaches. But I do recommend looking into the approach we did, which is slow changing code and fast changing code separately. Cool. So Håkan, I think I'm ready for any questions. If there are any other questions from you all that I haven't covered so far during the talk. All right, Karim has a question here. What are your thoughts on the trade-offs of doing this as an in-band, as an out-of-band change? Yes, this was a question again. So yes, I think it's in place versus having a separate application, if I understand this correctly. I think it really depends on your application, Karim. To be honest, doing it out of place, like a separate application, we never considered it, to be honest. It never passed our minds. I'm not sure exactly why. I think it just was such a big application and so many projects, and managing that side by side would have been very difficult, and it caused a lot of overhead overall. And we also had a lot of technical depth in our application that we want to clean up directly, and in place just made it a lot easier. It made it easy for developers to know where to go. It made it easy for us to just overall change things. So to be honest, we never thought about it. It's probably not completely a bad idea, and it could probably be very useful for a lot of businesses. Going forward, would you put less focus on unit tests in favor of functional tests? Great question. No, I would not. So unit tests are still useful, right, for feature development. For features, you still need to make sure they work, and unit testing is the key to do that. So continue doing them if you do them. They are super useful. But what you need to run on a regular basis to make sure you haven't broken anything when you update a package or move something over is the functional tests. They will really show you kind of those key points here, and that's why I think they're so important. So as always, continue doing both. That's all.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Alexander. Yeah, I mean, you can still ask questions here while we. Yeah, so here's a new question here.
Yeah, thank you for a good presentation.
Thank you.
And there's a question.
Karim asked a question. Yeah, any tips for finding the binary redirect war? So I think Morten had a good suggestion. I think I recommend you kind of trying to auto-generate redirects if you can. It is definitely something you can use. It is just something that you may not work for you. And I think I forget his name now, but a Stack Overflow developer that is very good at Twitter to give you good advice. They went through the same kind of journey as well, taking Stack Overflow from .NET Framework to .NET Core, and he tried also using auto-generated attributes, and it did not work for them either. And he had a long blog post about fighting redirect wars. So I guess I'm saying is that you probably will fight it at some point. When it comes to the strategy around that and the tips for it, you will, after a while, learn how to write those redirects so it makes sense to you. But I would look, if you look in the Visual Studio, you can actually find dependencies for your NuGet packages. You can see what they depend on, what version they're expecting. So what you want to try to find there is the common middle ground. And usually that's the older version if possible. But it's not that easy all the time. I'm sorry. I don't really have a good tip for it. It's just try to be cheerful, try to be happy, start with a positive attitude, and also lean on your colleagues and peers in that kind of endeavor, because it is very complicated. I'm not going to try to hide that or sugarcoat that. It's just very tricky.
And I have a question. In what situation would you not migrate?
Good question. So if you know your application is going to be sunsetted, it's old, it has like web forms and a lot of old technologies, I would just make sure you just rewrite it instead from scratch. So my client, for example, had the same situation where they had a small application, very old stuff, very difficult to maintain already, but it was very small. So it wouldn't take a lot of effort to rewrite it. So for that case, we just decided to say, okay, goodbye. We're going to write you in Blazor in containers instead. We're going to try some new stuff from scratch. So it depends on the size of the application, I think, and the business value it provides.
Okay. Yeah. So I think that is it for tonight there. So then we would like to thank you, Alexander, for a really nice presentation, and also thank everyone in our audience. If you're watching this live or if you see this on our YouTube channel, thank you so much for tuning in. And as we said here, right now we have an open CFP for Global Azure, so please submit to that if you want to speak about anything Azure related. And then we're looking forward here to seeing you in our next event there. And we also got some more comments here from the audience.
Thank you all. Had a great time. Appreciate it.
Yes.
I'm glad I was helpful. As always, as well, I just want to add, if you want to chat about this afterwards, Twitter, LinkedIn, wherever you want to talk about it, I'm happy to just be a sounding board for any of your thoughts there to guide you in the right direction.
That's a question.
We had a final question here from Morten.
Yes, we definitely got backtracked, carried away a couple of times. Once you feel comfortable doing this, you kind of like, I'm just going to remove this stuff because it doesn't make any sense. And we did that a couple of times where we went too far with like being fearless and we broke things. But we only really had 2 production issues in a year's time where we went a little far here. So overall, pretty okay because we had our functional test that could have pulled us back a bit. But definitely carried away sometimes for sure.
Yep. So thank you so much and looking forward to seeing you in our next stream.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.